Back in the mid-90s, the Nintendo 64 and original PlayStation dominated the fifth generation of consoles. Competition was fierce, with numerous classic games stacking up against each other. On PlayStation's side, you had narrative-intensive games such as Final Fantasy VII, as well as content-rich games such as Gran Turismo and Metal Gear Solid. Meanwhile, Nintendo 64 had the best action-packed games such as GoldenEye, Rogue Squadron, and Star Fox 64. It also had the best 3D platformers such as Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. What's interesting is that these two consoles had different game libraries not just because designers were coming up with different ideas on each side, but because of the technical differences between these two platforms. Make no mistake, these two systems are vastly different in how they operated, which forced game designers, or at least the ones who knew what the hell they were doing, to adapt their games design. So what were those differences and how did they manifest themselves? Well, let's answer that question today. I'm Dr. Waters, this is Game Design Wit, and today we'll look at the four main differences that impacted game design between the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. The first significant difference is in static storage space. Think of static storage as the location where you find all the game's data, such as images, sounds, environments, and character models. As you may know, the PlayStation 1, which back in my day was just called PlayStation, used CDs which provided for its time a ton of static memory space. This might not seem much by today's standards, but back then the average Super Nintendo game took 2 to 3 megs of space, whereas in PlayStation you could fit 600 megs in a CD. This was a monstrous leap in gaming. Meanwhile, the Nintendo 64 relied on cartridges, which held on average about 10% of what a CD could. Now there were some exceptions to this rule, like Resident Evil 2, but what this boiled down to is that pretty much all Nintendo 64 games had to confront the fact that they simply wouldn't have as much storage space as even the most banal PlayStation game had access to. But it's not like cartridges sucked though. They did have an advantage over CDs, which is the second main difference between these two consoles: transfer speed. You see, static storage, the CD, is exactly what the word implies. It's static. The console can't change any information that's there. It can only read from it. But what's the big deal then? Well, you know when Mario moves from the left to the right? That's a change of information that can't occur in static storage space. Remember, you can only read Mario's location. You can't write a new one. To address that, consoles have to load the contents of static storage into volatile storage, also known as RAM. It's in RAM that these two consoles can alter and play around with information. It's there that Mario can move, jump, punch, and fly. How fast a console loads information from static storage into RAM is known as transfer speed, and the Nintendo 64 could load content 100 times faster than the PlayStation. So what this all meant was that PlayStation games had slow access to a lot of content, while Nintendo 64 games had fast access to less content, and this had a huge impact on their respective game design. For example, this is why you couldn't have a game like Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64. This game has hundreds of detailed background images, each one detailing the world you were exploring. Each time you entered a new location, the game would read the background image from static storage and display it to the user. This game relied so heavily on this technique that it needed 3 CDs to put all this content together. However, reading each one of these images took time, which is why the game forced the player to slowly traverse from one section of the background to the other, even though there wasn't any impending obstacle right in front of them. Think about it. If the player could move 4 times as fast, they jump through the background so quickly that most of their actual playtime experience will be watching load screens. This meant games that depended on this technique of rich background images needed to have a slow pace. This explains the rhythm of games such as Resident Evil, Chrono Cross, Legend of Dragoon, Parasite Eve, and Man in Black. Remember Man in Black for the PlayStation 1? Me neither. Meanwhile, Nintendo 64 fast transfer speed allowed designers to build games in which you could traverse from hub world to game level and back in less than a few seconds. This helped maintain the game's immersion. Using this advantage, designers built vast interconnected environments which players could freely explore. Games such as Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and Jet Force Gemini leveraged this technique to great extent. The fact that loading content was inexpensive meant that playing a game like Mario 64 was all about exploration and running and jumping and finding as much as you could about the world. It meant you were not afraid to traverse back and explore areas. The game even invited you to do so since several of its secrets would only be found this way. Now imagine that experience on PlayStation where each time you entered a room, it would load, and you would sit and wonder, oh no, I'm in the wrong room, let me turn back, and then load a bit more. Super fun. The third discrepancy between these two consoles is in their rasterization capabilities, which is a fancy way of saying how they drew 3D stuff on screen. Here is where it gets interesting, because although the Nintendo 64 can render 3D content faster when compared to PlayStation, PlayStation games, like I said previously, had the advantage of relying on a larger library of content available in static storage. What all of this meant was that the Nintendo 64 can render more of the same stuff, while PlayStation can render less, but of more diverse things. Here's an example. Take a look at Ocarina of Time's landscape. The Nintendo 64 can render content all the way across the sky, but notice that the grass is a repeated array of the same foliage covering the entire plane. Meanwhile, on PlayStation, Metal Gear Solid's camera is placed top-down to limit your field of view. Even when looked in first-person view, you still see how small the environment is when compared to the lush landscapes of Zelda. However, because PlayStation games had access to more content, these small environments were rich with detail, such as posters, placement props, sound effects, and all sorts of different things. Due to high static storage but low rendering capabilities, PlayStation games relied heavily on a technique called texture mapping. Texture mapping is when you want to render a triangle and then overlay an image on top of it. Look at Vagrant Story, whose environments are filled with detail even though the areas they portray are quite small. Meanwhile, on Nintendo 64, games relied heavily on a technique called GOURAUD shading. This allowed the developer to state for each point in a 3D triangle a color, which the hardware would then scale evenly across. Since you were only supplying data for 3 points on a triangle, as opposed to using an entire image, GOURAUD shading saved a ton of static storage, which remember the Nintendo 64 didn't have as much as the PlayStation. This explains the discrepancy of character models between, say, Metal Gear Solid and Mario. If you look at Mario's character's model, you see that it's largely composed of triangles without textures, but still contain an explicit color that's spread across the model. Meanwhile, for Metal Gear, you see the entire model overlaid with a texture. Pretty much all character models between these two consoles display this technical and design discrepancy. But characters aren't just about how they look, but also how they sound and act. Both these consoles can render 3D content, but their tech still wasn't up to speed in properly doing facial animations. This really only came about in the 6th console generation. Since the PlayStation has more room for storage but less 3D capabilities, games like Metal Gear Solid resorted to using live-action dialogue where their character heads moved to symbolize speech.
He's alive. You're the Arms Tech president, Kenneth Baker, right?
Meanwhile, games for the Nintendo 64 rely on text to express dialogue, but resorted to exaggerated body movements to denote emotions. The fourth discrepancy is that Nintendo 64 games could render 3D content faster, and it had 4 controller ports as opposed to PlayStation, which only had 2. This meant Nintendo dominated the split-screen multiplayer experience for consoles of that generation. Ask anyone that played GoldenEye multiplayer back in the day, and they'll tell you that it was freaking awesome. Then ask them about their Medal of Honor multiplayer experience, and they'll say, "Oh man, I don't know, I was too busy playing GoldenEye." There's one last discrepancy between these two consoles that I haven't mentioned so far, which is full motion videos, which only the PlayStation has. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because full motion videos are neither gameplay nor a proper movie, no matter what anyone else says, ever. Now before I go, let me ask you a question. Why does any of this matter? Why am I spending my time to teach you about techniques that are mostly obsolete? I mean, these consoles are so old, they feel like they came before World War I. The fact is, just because some technical limitations no longer exist, doesn't mean that all technical limitations no longer exist. Sure, consoles nowadays are so powerful they can almost do your laundry, but I guarantee you developers everywhere are hitting their limitations on a daily basis. If you work in game design, you will eventually hit a brick wall with an idea you have. Maybe the hardware isn't powerful enough. Maybe its control scheme doesn't play well with consoles. Maybe that awesome level you made takes 5 minutes to load. It doesn't matter what it is. You will eventually encounter a limitation in one way or another. And it's at that moment, as a game designer, that you have a choice. You could back away from your idea, or you could embrace whatever limitation you're dealing with. You could make that limitation part of your idea and turn it into an original and compelling experience. Great design isn't just about huge and grandiose moments. Great design can be found in the simple and mundane elements of gameplay, be it a sound effect or a camera angle. In the end, a great game is the sum of its good parts as well as its limitations, just like its creators. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Hey everyone, hope you guys enjoy watching this video. Feel free to drop a comment below as well if you know of a technical limitation that turned into great game design. I'm always curious to learn more about those myself. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and share if you'd like to see more. Lastly, if you want to see another video where I discuss games as art, click on this link right here.